Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers in arms, welcome back to the Conversations That Quack, episode number 5. Your conversational podcast for the thoughts that linger when the lights go up and the credits are long over. I am one of your hosts, Brandan Jones, and joining me downstream on this adventure, the man, the myth, a quack who will not let you slap him around and call him Susan, Mr. Yfran Garcia.
Heyo, glad to be back.
And if you're just joining us well into the future or in near real time, welcome. This is a podcast where Yfran and I rock an often candid and honest conversation about the variety of issues facing the Black movie protagonist in our movie of the week and where that ultimately leaves us as a people. If you enjoy what you hear, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/PANDORA'S QUACK, where you can gain early access to podcasts like this one, as well as our sister podcast, The Movies That Quack, where co-host Wade Slicken and I put each other on the spot each week to ask each other Hollywood's most poignant and stupid questions, as well as The Rabbit Holes That Quack, where co-host Nicole Matthews and I do a weekly deep dive into documentaries that mostly have something to say. But of course, if parting with that dollar to become a supporter of our Patreon is not in the cards for you right now, that is more than okay. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for more upcoming shenanigans from Pandora's Quack. And so, without further ado, these are the Conversations That Quack. Tonight's movie of the week is called Blankman, despite the fact that my autocorrect constantly wants to call it Blackman. Blankman is about a simpleton inventor who becomes a superhero with a bulletproof costume and a low budget. It is directed by Mike Bender, who's responsible for The Upside of Anger, Man About Town, and Reign Over Me. It is written by Damon Wayans, whose credits include Mo Money and Major Pain, as far as writing goes. And then J.F. Lawton, whose credits include Pretty Woman, Under Siege, and Chain Reaction. Stars Damon Wayans, David Alan Grier, and Robin Givens. Currently sitting on Rotten Tomatoes at a critical rating of 19%, whereas the audience rating is 41%.
Ooh.
Yes. Last week, listeners, Mr. Garcia, we kicked off our superhero theme with Fast Color, where we both thought it was just okay. And if the planned TV series does make its way to the small screen, it'll hopefully elevate some otherwise good ideas that the movie underserved. I think we both made recommendations for other movies that listeners should check out instead. But this week, the theme continues with Blankman from 1994. So listeners, you know the drill. Before we jump in, here is your official blanket spoiler warning for the movie. So feel free to hit pause or save this podcast until you've had a chance to check out Blankman in case you've missed it over the last 25 years. Yfran, let us begin. How long had it been since you feasted your eyes on Blankman? I don't know if we spoke about this on the air or not, but just to clue in the listeners for this 25-year-old movie.
Oh man, maybe like 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
So definitely over a decade. But it's been a long time, and I'm happy that you pulled this movie up again because it definitely gave me a good. Now that you're older, you watch these movies when you're younger, right? And then when you get older, you have a different perspective.
Yeah.
I still like the movie, so glad to see that I liked it back then, and I like it now as well. But
Yeah.
definitely been a long time since I've seen it.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into the adult eyes versus kids' eyes. There are definitely some things that I found quite surprising as an adult that I completely went over my head as a kid. It's pretty funny. But yeah, it was definitely, it's been a while because I think as we were talking about last week a little bit, I hadn't seen it since it was on VHS, which I think either my cousin owned or we may have rented from Blockbuster. So of course, two things that in that last sentence, anyone under the age of 20, 25 might not know what they are. When you look back on it sort of before, kind of revisiting it for the podcast, broadly, and I think you just kind of addressed this, do you kind of remember it fondly, kind of being funny, or there's just sort of like just a general, because the thing about like the Wayans is I feel like my first, that's the Wayans, was the Wayans show that was on WB Network, I think is what it is. But like obviously they kind of have always been making movies. But yeah, when you kind of look back on it, do you remember kind of like how, what the perception was?
When I look back on it, I do. I remember what the perception was. I remember it's it's crazy to me because I still remember lines from the movie, even though I
Yeah,
haven't seen it in a decade.
yeah,
Which is quite interesting to me. So I liked it back then. I still like it now. So I think that I still hold it dear to my heart for some reason. I think it's just maybe one of those child movies I watched back then, growing up. I watched a lot of movies back then. I watched a lot more movies back then than I do now. So growing up, when I can remember the lines of a movie like this, it's definitely one that I hold dear to my heart. So yeah, I definitely remember some of the things that I witnessed today when I watched it again.
yeah. There are definitely some moments that I for. It's like funny the things that you hold on to that will become a part of your vocabulary or just sort of your bag of phrases that you use. And I definitely not until I saw this movie remembered like the phrase like, oh, well, will slap me around and call me Susan kind of thing. And like, I was just dying laughing watching that now because I was like, oh, I was like, is that where I get that from? Even though I don't like, I say it very rarely, but it's just like that kind of stuff or like the stuff about, like Shirley from like Airplane, some of the Leslie Nielsen stuff. It's just funny that
Yeah.
that's like from this era. I'd be very curious to know where those phrases originally came from, but I was just laughing that this is where specifically sort of it came from. So,
Yeah, and the way he said it, I just love his character. It's so funny, He's just back then it was I kind of relate to him because back then this is before my soccer days. Well, I guess I was learning soccer at the time, but I was no longer. I like to consider myself a jock, but I'm not any. Back then I wasn't yet, obviously. But I relate to him because I really felt like I was him, and I feel
mm.
like my brother was David Allen Greer in this movie. So I thought it was really funny the way he said it. Will slap me around and call me Susie. Even the way he said it was just so funny to me, and it sounds like something that I would say back in the day as well. So I really appreciated that line and knowing where it came from.
And of course, the guy be like, "Okay, Susan." Ah. So yeah, now having had the opportunity to check it out, what did you think? As I said, I think there are some things that were kind of like definitely. I guess I'll use the word shocking, not in sort of a bad or good, but just sort of like it kind of cracked me up when I kind of realized what some of the things, my favorite moments, were actually about. But yeah, what did you think about Blankman with 2021 eyes, Yfran, looking back at a 1994 movie?
Maybe it was me. Maybe I like, got some of these things. I think a couple of things that he does, Damon Wayans, um, does that I'm just like, oh, okay. Like, now watching it again, I'm just like, oh,
Yeah,
got it. Now I know what that means as an adult.
yeah,
But back then, I definitely didn't get him. To your point, I missed them back then, and I would have never understood that um, back then. But I think that the movie still, I don't think my perception of it changed that much, to be
yeah.
honest. I think I loved it back then, or liked it back then, and I still like it now. But there was just definitely a few things that, to your point, I kind of shocked me a little bit because I watched it back then, and this movie came out in '94. If I watched it in, well, give it a couple years, so even if I watched it in '96, I was what, 9, 10 when I watched this movie.
Yeah.
So I think that knowing what was happening in the movie now and watching it back then when I was 9 or 10 is definitely a bit shocking. But other than that, I think the movie was still a pretty good one for me. It's lighthearted, it's a comedy superhero movie, so to me, it's something that I really appreciate and love.
Yeah, I definitely got to give a shout out to the generation of parents watching this movie with their kids, or if their kids really dug this, because I had no idea this movie was as sexual. I think as I just don't remember like that being at the scale that it is. And there's a couple things we'll kind of dive into in a little bit, but I was just like laughing about that. I was just like, man, like I was like, when you think of, because when we were growing up, occasionally there would sort of be the classic parental outrage over, oh, is this for the kids? Because I remember people being like, is our Power Rangers too violent, and just like other kind of random stuff. Obviously, it's just because of social media, the scale of it has gone way up. But it's funny when I was watching this because I was like, man, like I really, like I was just trying to be in the mindset because I'm about, I guess I am the age that my parents were when I was born, which I've been thinking about a lot, which is kind of amusing. But then I'm just thinking like, okay, so then as I age, if I watch this movie it's still funny. I agree with everything you're saying. Like it's just one of those things where like certain scenes like they're still funny, and I think this movie is still really entertaining. But like the actual meaning of them just cracks me up. Because I'm just like, man, like I was like, you definitely couldn't get away with doing that in this kind of context now, and it would probably be I like maybe rated R now. Even though I also kind of laughed because when the movie started, it still had that like FBI like piracy warning. I was like, oh, they just ripped this like straight from the vault. But then it also was like PG-13 for crude language, and I was like, oh, that's amusing because because even when I remember like In Living Color and all that kind of stuff, they just went like I remember being a kid and being like they are going hard like with this and just kind of the stuff with Jim Carrey and Fire Marshal Bill and all the what is it, the Homie the Clown and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, this was still definitely really enjoyed it, but I was just definitely like shocked with like, oh, like when he's like overreacting to like just contact or just being in close proximity with Robin Givens' character, I was just like, oh, that's what that is. When I was a kid, I just thought that was like funny. Like I thought he was just because he's like such a dork, but then I was like, oh wow,
Yeah.
like they're really like got it. Oh, okay. I was like, that it's still funny, but it was just like, wow, like wow.
Yeah, same for me. That was the one. I feel like there wasn't many. I feel like that was the one.
Yeah.
I came into the movie knowing, like, expecting like what I already knew.
Yeah.
So like David Allen Greer he will to me never not be funny.
Yeah.
I think he is one of the funniest actors out there. I think he's just hysterical. His humor is mine. I think that for me, I just it's somebody I really get comedy wise.
Yeah.
He's in a few of my other like favorite movies, so it doesn't really like I guess I'm a little bit biased because he's also in Jumanji where he plays a cop.
Yes.
In Jumanji, and I think that he is amazing in that role. And then he's also in the army now, and he's like a sensitive dentist who's going to the army. He's involved in flossing, and then imagine this guy in the army. So it's just very like the role that he plays is always like of hysteria, and it just comes off so funny. So I think that going into it, like seeing David Allen Greer, with that being said, it's been a long time since I've seen a David Allen Greer movie.
Yeah, same.
So going back into it again and just having him make me laugh all over again. For me, he like really, really stole the show. But to your point, yeah, that the one things that the thing I missed in that movie that I realized today when I rewatched it was the contact scene with Robin Givens.
Yeah.
Which he kisses him and he let's just say it. I mean, I think he's having an orgasm.
Yeah.
A kiss. If that's it. I don't know what's going on there, but that's something I would have definitely never caught back then. So it was interesting to see that again.
Yeah. We also had your matriarchy situation call out, which I thought was amusing.
We did.
Yeah, and it was because again, like it was one of those things when you brought up in the context last, with Fast Color, that definitely sort of like opened my eyes, I think, because I never really thought about that before. And then when you really start to look into just older movies, you either have both parents or it's the single mother, or when it's just sort of like the older grandparent that's sort of still alive, it is usually the grandmother, and then they'll call her like Big Mama or something like that. And so it was kind of interesting to like watch that was the case here, when it very easily probably could have just been, a mother sort of situation. But I think the way that they were made this sort of a grandmother, I just thought was really interesting. And there's like a lot of language, like cinema language and kind of cultural language that I think you kind of can infer when it's sort of a grandma. So it was just a lot of stuff that I think this movie managed to do by having it be like, oh, these kids are just sort of, as they grew up, they were raised by their grandmother and then kind of in this neighborhood, in this apartment and all that stuff that I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and then they tied in the whole, this grandma who is, has this African American matriarchy, which we spoke about last week.
Yeah.
And if you missed that, obviously everybody go back and check that out. It was a good conversation last week.
Yeah.
But this week as well, you see it again. And I relate to this one as well because we call my mother, like everybody calls my mother Big Mama.
Yeah.
Her license plates literally is Big Mama. It's her license plates. So I think it's really another thing, like another testament to us. Like I see my mother and she's very strong. My grandma, I think, was the greatest woman of all time. And I think that, the same things I see in these matriarchs in these movies are the same things I see in my own family. So
yeah.
I always relate to that, and I love seeing it. I always call it out because it's something I relate to.
Yeah, I also really liked the music. And I don't know, because like, well, obviously kind of as we go deeper into the podcast here, we'll watch newer stuff, but I feel like they don't, like, obviously they use a lot of pop for movies now, they use a lot of, they'll do like original scores, they'll have pop, and they'll have like rap kind of things, or maybe some of the, if they end up having, like if J-Lo's in it, they'll have a J-Lo song. If Cardi B's in it, they'll have a Cardi B song, and kind of so on and so forth. But I just remember like watching this, and it's definitely very much of the time. And a lot of this I'm kind of remembering because I just rewatched Coming to America a few months ago, to kind of get caught up before Coming to America 2 came out. And just the gospel kind of music, the R&B music, it just kind of cracks me up because it's like, when we kind of jump into the, romantic comedy, romance kind of section of the podcast, foreshadowing for people, we will be watching Love and Basketball at some point. It'll just be very interesting to see like how the musical cues kick in, because I don't think they do that as much anymore. It feels like it's more of a business, if you will, like more of a, oh, well, this artist is popular. Like they're kind of building sort of a financial success puzzle. Whereas in this era, it felt like the music here was really supposed to convey this vibe. And so it's like when you see Robin Givens and like David Unger, and there's like this music, or kind of like when she's with Blankman and just like this music, and even kind of like underscoring the matriarchy and the grandma, just the whole like gospel music and stuff. Like it just has this very, very tangible feel that kind of, to your point, does trigger a lot of memories to kind of make it almost much more relatable without them having to sort of explicitly say it, kind of thing, which is kind of amusing that from this era.
Yeah, I agree, and I love that. I love that about these movies.
Yeah.
Going back and saying, "Wow, I haven't heard this song in ages."
Yeah.
But it's a banger.
Yeah.
I feel like songs. And you speak about Love and Basketball. Get ready for Maxwell. I think that's an artist that you're going to hear
Totally forgot about him.
when we talk about. I think it's an artist you're going to hear when we talk about Love and Basketball. But you get the Maxwell and the D'Angelos back in these movies, and the R&B, the Keith Sweat, and I just. Oh man, I love that stuff, and I agree. I think that soundtrack is something that, even going back, I think I just recently watched Coming to America as well. I watched that because I wanted to, same thing as you. I wanted to get ready for Coming to America too, which I thought wasn't good at all, but that's totally fine.
Yeah.
I think the music back then was so good, and even going back further, Beverly Hills Cop was another movie that came out in the 80s, late 80s, right when I was born. And the soundtrack for that one is so funny because it's songs that were huge before you were born, but you can tell like that was the groovy, like that was like the songs of the generation. So music plays such a huge part of this because it takes you back. It's so nostalgic. And my sister was huge, like in my music influence back in the day when I was growing up. She was 3 years older than me, and all the songs that were new in R&B, hip hop, she would have them all. So all the songs that I even know are because of her. And when I hear these songs again, it just takes me back to the time of growing up in an African American household. So I appreciate it again.
It's funny with music because growing up, my sister was always listening to stuff just like the archetype of the black girl who's just constantly, listening, like blasting sort of the radio and the boombox and all this kind of stuff. And it cracks me up because like I've always been sort of indifferent to music. I'm more of a visual pairing. Like if it's just a song, I kind of like, oh, that's cool. But like if I see the video and I think the video is cool, then I'll kind of permanently remember the song. Or if I see it like laid over like a great like scene in like a show or a movie or a commercial or something, I'm much more likely to remember it and kind of think fondly of the song. And so because of that, I just remember my sister would always try to like play songs to try to get me to like remember them. And I think it was even to the extent that like she would play like hip hop when I was like falling asleep, just so that it would like seep in there somewhere, which like cracks me up because like now I'll talk to her about that and be like, I wonder if that's why I'm like still sort of indifferent to music, or if it's why like I'll like listen to things and then try to like arrange it or put it together or like beats or whatever. But then similarly, I went probably, I don't know how you found EDM, but like I went like way down that rabbit hole because my college roommates who were all international and they just played nothing but like ATB and Kylie Minogue and like all these people in college. But it's just funny that like you're saying like your sister and that, just like the relationship that you guys have like through music. It's pretty cool. I do wonder how much that's replicated sort of through, again, through the culture.
For sure. ATB, man, wow, that is a huge call out. Thanks for bringing that up. He's my second favorite DJ of all time. So Andre Tannenberger from Germany. So thanks for calling that out. That's amazing. Wow. That was good. I just got goosebumps when you said his name.
Yeah, there was a what also cracked me up was somewhat, it was like a meme or something that had like the most And again, like I wouldn't even consider this a deep cut. You may kind of get this, but it was like two people. I think it was like two women or something like that. And I don't even remember what the meme was, but I just remember one of the comments was like all the things she said running through her head. And I just started like laughing. Yeah. And then I would just tell my friend when he started like cracking up about it. And I was just like, they're not gay. They just love each other. And like he would both just start dying laughing because we were just like, I remember them saying that all the time back then. And I was like, I don't know what's going on. I just like dig this song, but I was like, I have no idea what's going on with those two. But yeah, it's another musical deep cut.
I think they weren't they lesbians or no?
I think that was like, and again, it's weird because there's no social media type thing like back then. But it's like I think I always assumed they were, but I feel like I remember watching an interview or something where they were like they weren't. They were just like very very close. And like obviously back then, I'm just kind of like, oh, okay, cool, shrug. Like it didn't really like matter. Like now, I probably would be like looking into it, like reading articles or watching like people like breaking down these like stupid like analyses of like, well, during this concert, the way that like they held it, like, because that's just like what would happen now. But yeah, I just remember back then, I think like one or two times, I think I remember seeing them be asked about it on like MTV or something, and then just like, oh, okay, shrug, and then like that was the end of it. But yeah, that's fine.
For sure. I mean, they had some bangers back in the day. I used to love Tattoo as well.
Yeah.
And good for them. I think they're Russian, so
yeah,
good for them. Good tunes.
To the point about coming to America, which is something in this movie that I kind of started laughing about. Why are black people always working at McDonald's? Like, did McDonald's, like, listeners tell us? Like, is there...
Whoa. I mean,
is there something...
America with McDowell's, first of all. That's a huge difference.
Like, is there just, like, was McDonald's just like, okay, here's the... we're just going after this demographic from late 80s to 90s. Listeners tell us that. Because I remember like watching that and just being like, oh, that's another, again, it's only 2 movies, but I was like, oh, I wonder if we're going to start seeing this like more and more often. Like if that was just the way McDonald's kind of handled things, like product placement and all that stuff. But I just laughed when that happened. But yes, you're 100% correct. It was McDowell's. It wasn't the Arches. It was the, what was it? It was like the
Arcs,
like,
I think.
Yeah.
What a movie! I'm sorry. The original the first Coming to America, was just world class in my opinion. Yeah. I think the second one, we can talk about this another time. Yeah. But I think the second one fell real short. But it was hard. I think the second one just couldn't replicate the original. So I'm not going to give it too much crap there. But yeah, let me stay on track here. And I don't understand the McDonald's infatuation either. The only thing I'll say is I think that it was a cultural moment. I think it was pop cultural at the time.
Yeah.
I think McDonald's was just booming. I think everybody just knew what McDonald's was, and it was booming. It was also global. So I think it's just one thing that was easily relatable to many people.
Yeah, because when like Daryl's like working there and he's like the manager and they kind of like running through everything. And I just remember just being like, I was like, did I miss something about McDonald's and just the culture back in like the late 80s and 90s? But I was just like, but to your point, like it may have just been one of those just very, very easily recognizable things, because there may have even been like at the time commercials on TV about like, we're hiring and blah blah blah. Because I do remember, I almost want to say, I definitely remember how long ago this was, but it was long enough to where you'd see commercials and they would obviously play in a certain market, so then it would have like maybe a little bit of hip hop kind of into it, or it'd be like featuring black people, and it was because it was in like the quote unquote urban areas, and then they would have the other version of the commercial that might be more rural or whatever. So I'm just wondering if this is like a part of McDonald's master plan back in the day, but that definitely like pinged on my radar, because I was just like, why is I was like, I mean, I guess that's where he would be. That is sort of like the default job, I guess, because even like Chris Rock, I think, was talking about, I was listening to some of his comedy the other day. He was like, oh yeah, he worked at McDonald's. So I guess that was just the thing, like back in like the 80s and 90s. Yeah, McDonald's may have just been far more integrated into the culture then.
I think it was also it was just a good way for him to get a job, right? I think like that's if we take it back to the context of the movie.
Yeah.
At the point McDonald's, made its debut in the movie, this is when he was just in the bank. The police officers haven't gotten paid in a long time, so the crooks came, Manelli and his gang came, and people thought that Blankman was the one who ruined the cops getting paid or whatever it was, and the mayor dying. So after that, he went into depression or whatever it was. They lead you to believe that he was just down on his luck and didn't want to do the whole Blankman thing anymore, because he was getting blamed for being a crook, even though he was trying to be a hero. And then, his brother Kevin is like, don't just mope around, maybe you should get a job. And then right after he says get a job, it's like, can I take your order at McDonald's? I think it was just kind of symbolizing how easy it is to get a job at McDonald's. Like, even if you're down in your luck, you don't know what you're going to do, you don't have a job, but you can always go to McDonald's and get a job. It's just that easy. So I think that was an interesting dynamic because he goes from being this superhero in his own right, and people saying, oh my God, who's this Blankman guy? He's a superhero, to working at McDonald's. And it's funny because, like, the one thing I think is really funny about this movie is that he looks exactly the same with the costume or without the costume. Like, how could you not know that it's that guy? It's the same guy. So I think it's like people are like, oh my God, who's his identity? Who is he? But it's literally like if you ever saw this guy in the street for the first time, you would know it's him. So I just think it's something. It's not like Batman, although there's a lot of like Batman components. Like, obviously, the brothers loved Batman. So he was like really, really inspired by Batman and Robin. This is how he became like Blankman in the future. Obviously, after his mother was killed by Manelli, he wanted to take action. He wanted to clean up the streets. And I think there's a lot of Batman components to it, but even Batman had some sort of mystery. Like Superman had mystery, right? Like you didn't know their identity. So I think in this one, I struggle. He always kept on saying that he wanted to hide his identity, but I always gave me a chuckle because he looks exactly the same. He just has something over his eyes, but he still has his bald head, So I just thought that was kind of funny, the whole transition from superhero to McDonald's and hiding his identity.
Well, it's not only the bald, like just a clearly bald, shiny head. It's the fact that he speaks in such a hyper-specific way that there's really no way that you wouldn't know it's him. And then on top of that, David Allen Greer, and he's like, other guy, has a very distinctive mustache. So it's not like you wouldn't, So it's not like you wouldn't know that was there. And then what's funny about that is like, I don't know that anyone has really figured this out, because one of the things that cracked me up for a really long time is Diggle from the Arrowverse on the CW. When everyone else was getting masked, he would just like go out there until like my like joke with a few friends is I was like, is the presumption that they're like, oh, if a black guy is just out there fighting crime, like no one's looking for him kind of thing, whereas like Arrow's got the hood and other people have like mask and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, this is so like such a strange choice, like creatively, what is going on here? And I think enough fans finally complained. So then he ended up getting like a helmet of some sort, which was like, all right. But then the other thing that was like also wildly absurd that like never got acknowledged was this other guy later has this like giant afro. He's like this like scientist, and he also starts fighting crime. And whenever they go to fight crime, he has cornrows. But then like when he's not fighting crime, he has like the giant afro. And so I remember like laughing, like my dad was like laughing to tears about it, because he was just like, what's the leap in logic that we're supposed to understand right now? That when the bat signal or the equivalent of the bat signal goes up, he has like a machine that like cornrows his hair. Like what's like, that takes a long time. Like I don't know if you ever had cornrows, but like that's like in hours, especially for the amount of hair that he had. And so it was just one of those things where you're kind of like, what, like this, there's no, like, what is going on right now? And so it's funny that too, that you definitely like call that out, because it is one of those things where like, unless the like theory with Superman, at least, is that the reason he can get away with the glasses is that no one is expecting Superman to be walking around like a normal person. So it's never the, like, you may go, oh, that guy kind of looks like Superman, but like, it just wouldn't make sense to you. Like, why does Superman like working, like riding a bike or like that kind of stuff? But like with this, especially with like, you know, and maybe this is what Robin Givens kind of know, like when she's like, well, I guess the assumption is that she figures it out. It's a little bit further into the movie, listeners, but like when she starts to sort of figure out like his identity, the presumption is that it's because of the grandmother sort of comment. But again, I guess, you know what though, that makes sense, because she never actually meets him, I think, until the end. So that might actually like be, that may make sense. But like if that actually might be a clever screenwriting thing because of exactly what you're talking about, because I don't think he actually interacts with anyone as both people, because it would just give it away immediately. He is pretty much only Blankman around a certain amount of people, and then he's rarely Daryl, because I guess Daryl is kind of more of the recluse, and then he worked in that like repair shop. So
it makes sense only until McDonald's. Like you get to he's now taking your Blankman. This guy's been in national television because of what he's been doing, is now giving you your food at McDonald's. How, I just don't understand how nobody in the restaurant now we're digging deep. I don't understand how nobody in the restaurant would be like, wait a minute, like you're Blankman.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, for me, it's just like so obvious that you're Blankman.
Yeah.
So I totally get that part with Robin Givens. So like, she actually doesn't really meet the real Daryl until the end of the movie, so it works there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just don't get the McDonald's part. I'm not complaining about it at
Yeah.
all. I just don't understand how that works because he looks just so much. Both of them, right? Like he looks like the other guy. David Allen Greer looks like the other guy. So Robin Givens from the get go should have known that was David Allen Greer. So that was very, very easy for her to see that. She works with him every day, so she should have known that.
Yeah.
And then, you know, Blankman, Daryl obviously looks like Daryl. So I don't know. I mean, my only gripe there, but I'm not complaining about it.
Yeah. Now there's the costume thing I thought was like, it's funny thinking about it now because one of the things that I remember talking with Wade recently about was, you know, when they remake stuff or reboot it, I feel like they're still playing it too safe. Like they're not really going far enough in some instances. And so it would be amusing if they did try to remake this because I feel like they would almost try to give them much more official costumes, which would kind of go against the whole way that the movie opens, where it's like, here are just two kids. Because we all, you know, either tied a towel around your neck or, you know, a sheet or something like that. And so it kind of would go against the fact that they grew up, these kids, you know, watching Batman and Robin. And then when they got older, even though they kind of had the means to a certain degree to kind of do it, they just like kept doing it this way. That's the way that they know, kind of thing, with it, as far as like costumes and all that stuff. And even kind of the way that he does gadgets and that kind of thing. Like when he's using the, I guess the egg beater thing to retract down into the elevator, how slow that is. He's just like, almost there, dun, 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 dun.
I'm almost there now. It's so funny. When I saw that scene, I remembered the song of him coming down the elevator. That's really, really funny. And I think that I like that they make him super smart, you know, like he goes to the therapy session because his brother tries to bring him in to show that he's crazy, but then he like plays it off because he's just so smart. I love that whole scene.
Yeah.
And I love that they genuinely try to make him super, super smart.
Yeah.
I don't like, I guess let's take it a step back, because right now I think he's smart. You know, when I'm watching the movie again, I'm like, all right, he's a smart guy. He knows how to fix things. He knows how to invent things. But when you're watching the movie like a decade, when you're like, you know, when I was younger and watching the movie in the 90s, it's like, oh, this guy's a nerd. You know, like he's a nerd.
Yeah,
so you have this balance of, is this guy a nerd or a geek, or is this guy just like super, super smart today, right? And back then it's like, they blur the line in modern times, and back then it's like, no, you're a nerd, you're a geek. And I like how they make him smart, but I don't like how they make him a nerd, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because like there's other ways of doing it, right? Like you see, like some of these movies are predictable. Like these superheroes are actually quite smart, right? Like, so I think that they have him being able to make this and make that, but they change his voice so he sounds nerdy. His inventions aren't quite revolutionary, so it's like they're almost like he has the half mind, but when he has the fix or the solution for these tools or these innovations, they're kind of just like not super pretty. Right? You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I like how they went into the whole part of like, this guy's smart. He could actually be a superhero because he could build his own Blankman mobile or have his own Blankman station, but it's not quite like Batman's high-tech solutions and innovations, right? And I think he even made a point. Did somebody even make a point about that? Or Kevin, his brother's like, no, you need money, you know, to do this, to have the resources or whatever it is. So I think that's something I have another issue with the movie about. I mean, it's not a big deal. Again, I'm not complaining about it. Just thing I want to call out because I think they tried not to make him super successful in a way. They try to keep him nerdy.
Yeah.
But I thought that it still worked because he was able to create his own innovations and be resourceful.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder, again, when you're kind of thinking about the early 90s and how you would be portraying this type of character on screen, and if there's as much thought, probably far less thought back then than there would be now as to like how this might be received. Whereas I think this was kind of like, hey, I have a really funny idea. Okay, let's go make this like cool, like low budget comedy sort of vibe. Because one of the things that I did pick up on that I thought was really fascinating was this movie really captured, and this maybe like, and it's hard to sort of like, it's something that as I kind of watch some movies kind of coming up, whether on the podcast or not, that I'll kind of be really tuned into. But like, you know how in some like places that you'll work, obviously there's sort of the mixture of everything. There's a mixture of sort of races and ages and this kind of thing. And you kind of get this, you know, melting pot of coworkers. But then there are that clique or those people sort of stick together, or those people sort of stick together. And the thing that I thought was really fascinating actually about Blankman is not only did it show these two kind of I'll just use class for the purposes of illustration, but like these two classes of work where it's like Hardline was this like basement kind of tabloid kind of thing, and then the other show that Robin Givens hosted as a sort of an anchor was kind of this upper echelon, like this is what you're supposed to be sort of attaining to. But then when we're introduced to all of those characters, we're only seeing pretty much the black employees, kind of with the throwaway lines and stuff, and kind of like their dialogue up front and center. And it was like the first time that I can like think of seeing, not so much that the movie I think does a really good job of being like, here are black people kind of just doing well kind of thing. You know, we talked a little bit about that with like the Cosby Show, and I think Blackish does this really well. It's just kind of like a matter of fact thing that it's just like, yeah, these are just sort of black people who are like have like great jobs and are kind of like at the, you know, pinnacle of sort of these career and sort of like positions. But it kind of also was like, hey, this is sort of what the black experience, if you will, at this job would be kind of thing, if that makes sense, where it's like, hey, like these are the people that like are, you know, David Allen Greer, like Kevin's friend, and this is who he would go upstairs to see. This is who you, and like you get like glimpses of that when you're like working wherever, where it's kind of like, oh, hey, these two guys know each other, these two girls know each other, these three, these four, whatever. And I just thought that was kind of fascinating. And again, kind of one of those things sort of in the culture of like, I wonder how that, if that was a conscious decision, or if that's just something that like, you know, when Damon Wayans is like writing this, he goes, oh, okay, well, this is kind of just how I see the world kind of thing. And like, to kind of bring it back to sort of the nerd aspect, that's also why I'm kind of like curious about that. Cause I agree with you. It's like, it's an interesting thing. And I wonder how much of it was, well, David Allen Greer is going to be the straight man, but David Allen Greer is also funny. So like, we have to make sure that we don't have these two guys who are sort of too similar kind of thing. So do we just push him that much further into the nerd kind of thing, even though, as you were saying, he is actually like really intelligent and he's really smart. He just kind of hasn't, the cliche obviously back then was like, oh, if you're really smart, then like you have no, you know, ability to sort of interact with women sort of thing, even to an extreme degree, kind of how this movie plays out. But it would be interesting to kind of see, I wonder if they're like interviews or kind of behind the scenes things. It'd be cool to see how Damon Wayans like constructed that character to a certain degree, to kind of be like, well, there weren't really black nerds back then, or were there, but obviously just not portrayed, or was this just purely because, again, as I said, Kevin's character is supposed to be sort of straight, but also has this like comedic tint to him. Just how all that comes together. Cause I agree. It's definitely a very interesting dynamic, you know, cause you always have like, you know, even like Seth Rogen's usually kind of bundled with someone like that, or, even the like Chris Farley, David Spade kind of like infamous run that they had. It just kind of reminds me a lot of that.
Yeah. Well, very well said. I totally agree. And you know, it's perspective. Like we can't be mature, you know, like back then I can't be who I am now.
Yeah.
It's modern day. So when I'm saying this now, it's like, no, watch this movie now, but it was also, we have to be realistic and think this movie was made in the 90s.
Yeah.
And back then I was just like, this is a funny movie. This is fun. Like, I'm not thinking too much about this. You know, I'm going to watch this movie and then go to soccer practice, whatever it is. So I think that I totally agree with you. I think you hit it on the nail, and I think you brought it home. So nothing to add there. I totally agree.
Yeah, the other thing that I think is amusing that I don't know how they'll do going forward, because there's obviously the larger conversation about comedy, and we'll definitely dive super deep into that when we kind of jump into that trilogy, the comedy trilogy. But it's the sort of blatant harassment cracked me up, but it was like one of those things where I was like, yeah, this is like tough, because it's like, again, you go back to the 90s, even again, like I've just been listening to stand up for the last few weeks instead of podcasts, and it is amusing to see the types of things that they said. And I remember I think Eddie Murphy recently said after Dolomite, I think is what it was, where he was like, yeah, he's thinking about coming back to stand up, but he just realizes that like you just can't, like he wouldn't be able to say half the stuff that he said back then, even though they're just jokes, just because of just, you know, the climate and such that we're in. And I remember just watching the way that like Kevin is kind of going after, I forgot what her character's name is, but when he's going after like Robin Givens and he's just like, oh, hey, you know, and it's like not like gross, like they're nowhere near that. It is still kind of like funny and kind of lighthearted and sort of like this like very, this is what I'm trying to do. There's like a couple lines that like, you know, again, you probably would be, you know, HR would have something to say about that, but it's just interesting to watch that again, like those are the dynamics that very funny, still feels funny in the context of this movie, that like in the back of my head I was like, yeah, because one of the things obviously that like whenever we watch at least some of these older movies, I'll always kind of be thinking, oh, I wonder, A, could you make this movie today, and then B, would they try to make this movie today? And I think by the end of this movie I was like, yeah, I don't know that you could. Not necessarily because like the basic premise of just like two kids who are kind of in like an impoverished neighborhood are going to sort of avenge their grandma to a certain degree, and then just having sort of the filler that's around it. But just sort of the way that this movie is constructed, that works really well. I don't know that they would do that, and then what they would replace it with might actually undercut sort of the story of this movie, especially like even like just thinking out loud, it just occurred to me that it's like, oh, okay, well, if you have David Allen Greer, who's not portrayed as like stupid in this movie by any means, but he's like clearly sort of horny and just kind of wanting to go after like as a interesting foil, where he's just like the horny one that's like just very driven. All he's thinking about is like getting into Robin Givens' pants. But then conversely, all you have is Daryl then just driven to like solve this crime issue, and then getting into Robin Givens' pants is like the last thing on his mind. So again, it may have just been one of those contrasting foil things that they wanted to do with the character, but just interesting that like I don't know how they would handle that in modern times without breaking why I think the movie works and why it's funny to begin with.
I agree. I think if they did that in modern times, it'd be tough.
Yeah.
So I totally agree. I think they probably need a new cast to make that work. I don't even know David Allen Greer's modern movies if he has any.
Yeah.
But I always feel like back then he was playing the same character, not the same like role, but kind of like the same character. So I think it's he was just always funny. So I kind of liked his role in this one, and it just reminded me of why I love David Allen Greer so much.
Yeah, I definitely.
But to your point, I definitely agree. I think it'd be very hard to do this today.
Yeah, I definitely need to revisit his catalog, because it's to your like much earlier point. Like I had kind of forgotten how fun he is to watch, and I think it's part of, you know, we spoke about this a little bit with after watching what was that movie, Monster, about kind of just this upcoming class of young Black talent, and it is interesting because, again, this was like the heyday, because you just had so many, you know, Black stand-up comedians that were just like in and out of movies just all the time, and they were like all over TV with like these like shows. It's like In Living Single and like Wayans Brothers and like Jamie Foxx show. And, like it was just sort of like a very like, you know, the heyday, if you will. And like now there's like a handful of like dramatic actors that are probably in their like 20s, 30s, and then I think, as you said, there's like a lot of people who are like very young now that are kind of coming up all at about the same time, like in the 20s, like they're probably early 20s. Like I think Zendaya's like 21 or 22 or something like that. And so I hope that someone figures out how to really leverage all that talent for like ensemble things, for just like, you know, throwaway kind of just comedies like this. Like it's like this would, you know, would not be made with the intent to make $1 billion. This would be made to just be like, oh cool, here's a great feel good movie that people can kind of go see and like escape for 2 hours sort of thing. I just hope someone figures that out, because these movies definitely are very far and few between. I gotta kind of dig through Netflix too and see what their comedy game is like. It's been a while. Unlike that, clearly I just couldn't even watch it for experimental thing. The Melissa McCarthy, Octavia Spencer, is that her? Yeah, Octavia, I don't know. I have that movie where they're like superheroes. That movie just looked awful.
Oh right, it looked horrendous.
Yeah.
I'm not judging a book by its cover.
Yeah,
it did look horrendous.
Yeah,
like I actually saw the trailer for that, and I just no, not for me.
Yeah, that was that's a no for me, dog.
Huge no for me, dog.
Yeah.
Randy Jackson would say.
Yeah. You can also date a movie by when it references Arsenio Hall, which I'm always appreciating. Like when he's, because it's like, it was just funny because like it's all like it's like, you know, not too long ago it was always Jon Stewart, and then now it's like Fallon or, you know, any of the kind of people. But it's like funny, you like forget that, like, again, like that's what I was saying, this is like the heyday of like black culture on mainstream TV. So it just cracks me up that Arsenio Hall is just, they cut there. Like it's like, of course it is. And I remember watching Arsenio Hall too. So it was cool.
Yeah, yeah. I watched a couple myself, so it's definitely cool to see that.
Yeah. The thing that's interesting about this movie is I really appreciated the. I don't remember the inspiration being so closely tied to Batman, actually, and how they did try to figure out sort of these parallels, like even to this of like the blank station, and like I forgot, I think it's like the blank cycle or the Blankmobile, the motorcycle thing, and sort of like that parallel inside of this neighborhood. And like, as you said, when David Allen Greer is just like, you know, Batman had money and like you don't have anything sort of thing, and just watching that kind of cool juxtaposition, because you do have actually, I know the movie I'll recommend that's a solid sort of example of all this at the end here, so teaser listeners to keep listening. But just like that, okay, hey, we're in a small neighborhood, how do we sort of save our small neighborhood kind of thing? And so like when you think about the scale of it, it makes sense for, you know, you would have this smart guy who basically invents this like weird chemical kind of thing that makes his things bulletproof and all that kind of stuff, but doesn't give it to other guy, forgets to kind of soak his suit, which seems like that would have been easy to do in one go. A very not smart thing by Daryl.
Agreed.
But yeah, again, just like those parallels, especially when you look at like the blank station and just kind of like walking, when Robin is walking through there and just seeing sort of what Daryl is capable of doing. I just thought those kind of like cool things. I don't know that like, again, like that black culture outside of this movie, or really just kind of like just identifies with Batman, if that makes sense. Like it's like you see people on like YouTubers and stuff all like, you know, they'll talk about it now and just like, oh, it's cool, like, you know, he works out and does all this stuff. But it was just cool to like watch that this was kind of a this movie aligning itself so closely with, oh, we love Batman. That was the thing that we used to do, which I thought was cool.
Yeah, but you know, it takes me back. I agree, and it takes me back to, you know, last week we spoke about this, saying, can there be a black Superman or a black Batman? Can it be done?
Yeah.
And I go back to this movie, and the inspiration for this movie for well, at least the actors, you know, David Allen Greer and Damon Wayans, Blankman. At least for them, the inspiration was Batman, but then the movie comes off as like a poor man's Batman.
Yeah.
So like I kind of just like, and what's the difference? They're black, you know. So I just like I kind of like, now these are things that I'm thinking about now when I'm watching the movie again today.
Yeah.
Like obviously Yfran years ago would not have said this, but thinking about it now, it's like if another child is watching this, you know, where are the black superheroes that we can relate to growing up? Because Blankman is not to me a superhero that I can relate to, or a superhero that I want to be or even admire. You still have the predominantly white superheroes like Batman and Superman during those times. So I think like if we're gonna take it back to like last week's conversation, I think it still connects, because it did come off as like, oh wow, this is cool. Like it's like their inspiration's Batman, so haha, you get like Blankman. But if you really dig a little bit deeper, or again, maybe it's not a movie that we need to do this on, but it does come off as like Blankman is just a poor man's black Batman, which to me is kind of like, yeah. I get it, but like it's not. It kind of feels like it's sending the wrong message in a way.
Yeah, and that's why I think I still kind of come down on I wouldn't necessarily want a black Superman as much as, imagine if this movie was like very, very good and like less of a comedy and more of like, what would two people do who like lost their grandmother and like, you know, basically made a promise, not even like a vengeful, we're going to go be vigilantes, but like, you know, how do we solve this sort of thing? And just like watching them kind of grow up, and like maybe they do wear a mask, maybe they do like some of that stuff. And it's kind of one of those things where one of the movies that, you know, I'll see if we can kind of work it into one of the units here. The Spook Who Sat by the Yard. I call it like Black Fight Club, and it was actually banned when it came out for a little bit. kind of back in the 80s, maybe in like 70s, I think is when it came out. And it's just like this very like, it's the embodiment of why you in like movies and like in fiction and nonfiction, why like people like Martin Luther King were assassinated, and like I'm totally blanking on his name now, the guy from Judas and the Black Messiah, and like Malcolm X. And it's because they have this ability to kind of like organize a community and make them think clearly and kind of as one, and just like asking sort of these questions. And in that movie, it like really does, like and Spook Who Sat by the Yard, like really kind of ask you to sort of like, hey, you can kind of use this system against the people who created it. And it's like part sort of satire, but also like part like, oh, that's actually not that far-fetched. Like you could actually like do that sort of thing. I'll see if I can definitely work it in, or you should just definitely check it out. But it's along those lines. And so kind of like to bring that around to like what you're talking about, it's almost like, this is kind of why I was saying like it's interesting, because you, on the one hand, like I was saying, you have this movie that is clearly inspired by Batman and Robin, and maybe even sort of the silliness of Batman and Robin, because I think there's towards the end they even have like the the pow and the kapow and all that kind of stuff. But then it does kind of circle back to the last week's conversation about the Black Superman. It also does kind of say, hey, like the black version is sort of inferior kind of thing, or like the black version is like, of course it's not as good sort of situation. And I think that's why when that conversation started happening on the internet, and kind of when it came out that Warner Brothers is going to cast a Black Superman, I was like, I kind of don't want that. I just want something that's like equally as good. Like give me the way that like Black Panther came out, and now that's like the pinnacle, but like we should have Black Panther, we should have John Stewart Green Lantern, like we should have like, call it 6 or 7 other like heroes that you can name off the top of your head, that you could have an awesome debate about, oh, okay, well, like, could this, black superhero take out Superman? And it'd be like, oh, well, what's the situation? Would it be this, or would it be this? Is this person like, and there's really nothing like that currently. And like, that's when you kind of like zoom way out and you go, oh, okay, like how much of that is conscious and how much of that is unconscious? How much of that is, like I was just saying, well, we're going to do this and we're going to kind of have it so that like it's clear that there's sort of a level of inferiority, because it's, they're not spilling into like Beverly Hills. And I think it's sort of an unnamed city, if I'm thinking correctly. I think when they went past the skyline, it was clearly Chicago, but I don't know if they ever actually blatantly say it's Chicago. But it is one of those things where like I just would be curious to see how they would handle this now, specifically because of like all the stuff I'm talking about, and like how they would portray this, because I think people would pick up on exactly what you're talking about how this kind of, it's juggling the line that I think you can get away with in the early 90s about, here is our version of the 60s Batman and Robin set against this like backdrop of a story that takes place kind of in an impoverished neighborhood. But like if you were to do something like that now, kind of to my worry about them making a Black Superman, I just think that they wouldn't be able to thread that needle correctly, and it would either come off as like they're preaching about kind of what was going on, or it would just be like, why did you do this? This is kind of just dumb kind of thing.
Yeah, I totally agree there. I just think that, again, when I think about the fact there's just not a lot of Black superheroes, and then I come to this one, again, this is like more of like a today thing, versus like where I was back then. But when I think of what movies exist outside of Black Panther, which was phenomenal, then you have Blade, which I thought was phenomenal back then.
Yeah.
I can't even think of any other Black superhero movies except for Blankman, which is, more of like a lesser Batman for the Black community. So my gripe there with that for sure. And I feel like this movie, Blankman, was more based off Daryl and Kevin's love for Batman as inspiration, as opposed to like Batman overall. You still have like some components from Batman as well, right? You have Manelli, I think was the gangster's name. Kind of resembles Penguin in a way.
Yeah.
So I think it's like, I think you still have that a bit. Where they're trying to make it seem like Batman, you still have the onomatopoeia from that Batman used to have. So you still have like the the bam, the pow, those things like they had in the old Batman days. So I do think there's just still a lot of similarities, but I think that was homage to like Batman and their love for it, but not necessarily like this movie is Batman or should be even viewed that like that, because it should. So I totally get that.
There's even the nod to the 1989 Michael Keaton Batman when he does that plunger thing and like fires the wire that he kind of zip lines across, and it actually goes across the kind of the factory, and he goes into that painting. Like that's basically
Yeah.
like it's like a scene remixed, if you will, from exactly that scene in the 1989 Batman when Joker's in the museum and then Batman crashes in and does sort of the same thing. So
Oh, interesting. I see. I didn't even know that.
yeah, so it's and that's me. I just realized that as you were like talking about sort of the Batman stuff. So there might actually be more homages like that
Yeah.
to like that are buried in the movie of like people who like love Batman genuinely and like this is kind of just like their silly interpretation of it. So like to exactly the point that I think we've been both making, like for the 1990s, this was like this is exactly what should have happened. Like this movie is exactly what should have come out. I think it's just when you obviously use the lens that we have nearly 25 years later, and then if someone were going to attempt to make this movie again, I think there's just a lot of questions that you would have to sort out that you didn't back then because of just sort of the language of, you know, what is and isn't allowed in a movie and kind of what it's sort of allowed to do. But conversely, I think movies back then were just allowed to be movies because they were funny. Whereas like now you almost have to consider your audience probably too much if you're making a movie, so that you don't get yourself
Yeah.
canceled.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you just can't do this movie today and try to consider the things that we just spoke about,
Yeah.
you know. So I totally agree with you there. I think the movie was good for its time back then. And I think it's something you can't do today. I think you got that one right.
Can't have a movie where the woman's bathroom is the one place where you can't go.
I know. I don't understand. And then it was like the handicaps. Which is like another place you really, really can't go, or shouldn't go. So another quite interesting point.
Anything else that you can think of that we didn't address yet, including the nunchucks, the electric nunchucks?
No, I don't think there's anything else. I do think that they got all of the superhero movie components.
Yeah.
You know, you have everything you'd get in a superhero movie. You have you have a sidekick, you have a love interest, you have betrayal by Jason Alexander, who is their you know Kevin's boss at the news agency. He turned them in. You have a villain, right? You have the guy Manelli, who's kind of like Penguin in a way.
Yeah.
And then you have like even Gotham. Gotham had like a mayor, so you have like a commissioner. You have like the mayor, the good guy, who also wanted to help Blankman. So a lot of wow,
Yeah.
you know, just a lot of components of superhero movies, but like to your point, more towards Batman. A lot of Batman component. So you have it. It just, in my opinion, came off poor, but it's totally fine because back then we already spoke about it. That's what it should be, or that's what it should have been, and it was funny. I like it. I like David Allen Greer, and I like the movie.
Even the two called diabolical escapes with the bank and sort of the explosives, and then
Yep.
the being trapped in the water tank, just again very reminiscent of Batman and Robin.
For sure, yeah, yeah, good calls.
So yeah, it's very much a probably homage to that. I think there's even they definitely did that animated thing, I think, towards the end when you have Blankman and other guy running towards the camera to kind of officially be like, this is Batman and Robin, but in the hood instead of in Gotham.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Of course, is this, Yfran, for the listeners who've listened to us kind of probably go a little bit deeper than they were expecting into Blankman, is this required viewing? Do you think, despite sort of, our, again, kind of to reiterate, we both really enjoy this movie. It's just amusing taking a 2021 look at some of the particulars of this movie, especially when you kind of bring it 25 years into the future. But do you think it's something that people should check out from a required standpoint? Like it's like, hey, put this on your list for one reason or another. Is this something that, you would kind of like recommend, kind of like that medium middle of the road where it's like, yeah, this is something that maybe it's a good movie to watch for David Allen Greer, maybe a good movie to watch for the Wayans brothers and, just kind of like a black superhero to be a part of that conversation? Or are there just better movies? Skip this one. And there are other stuff that you can check out.
So this one for me really depends on what other movies of the genre exist. So
Yeah.
this is like a comedy. This is several things. This is a superhero movie, but also a comedy superhero movie, and then also a black comedy superhero movie. So I think for me, I don't know if there's a lot of other movies that fit all of those prereqs. So I don't know whether or not I want to say this is required or mid or not required at this point.
Mm.
On the surface, like on the surface, if there are no other movies of the genre and or none of that even matters, if you put a gun to my head and I told you what my recommendation was here or what my thought was, I
Yeah.
would say that this is a movie that you could pass on. There's better movies
Yep.
to watch. But I also think that this movie was meant to be a comedy and lighthearted. So
Yep.
I don't know a lighthearted superhero movie. So I don't know if it's one that I can fairly say that you should pass on without knowing what other movies of the genre exist.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. It's funny. I actually was Googling to see what sort of the third movie should be, and I'll give you a choice. Both of them you've heard of, but it's thin, man. Like it's very like, especially when you kind of go back and you're like looking at all these lists. A lot of it's so thin. For instance, that when you start looking at lists that are like black superheroes, like it was getting to the point where like, oh, here's the Avengers because Don Cheadle plays, blah blah blah, or here's this other like ensemble movie like what is it called? The Incredibles was on there, and I was like, Samuel Jackson is Frozone's only in there for like 10 minutes. Like I was like, why is that even like on this list? So it's like one of those things where like the genre is hurting, so you understand completely why Black Panther just like blows everything out of the water, and it deservedly so. It's a really great movie, but it's like one of those things where just like, yeah, there's not a lot to choose from, and even on these like top 10 lists, they're just razor thin. Like it's like there's just barely sort of anything on there, and there was some stuff that was like kind of obscure that I was like, I don't even know if you'd be able to like find that. Then I might just sort of like check out some of them. Like I think there was like one that was like, I forgot what it was called, but like the subtitle was like The Black Superman, and then when I like read what the description was, it was kind of like this like similar thing where it's like something's going wrong in the neighborhood, so they want to try to like stop it. So someone invents the such and such and gives this guy the chemical to like have superpowers, kind of thing, which is also kind of funny, which we'll kind of dive into probably later in the life of the podcast here, of just like what is the obsession with. There's an article I remember reading, like what is the obsession with black superheroes having lightning powers, and then something seems really fascinating about this era in time that I don't know if this was just happening out in like the zeitgeist, but just like a lot of science experiments that were kind of going wrong. Like obviously you have like The Fly, Jeff Goldblum, and like a few other kind of movies at this time. They were like very focused on like scientific experiments going wrong, but it's interesting that like that was kind of also happening in this community, because you remember like the Nutty Professor remake that happened, kind of infamous Eddie Murphy movie at this point, but just all those kind of scientific-ish movies were sort of happening in about this time. So it's really sort of fascinating to see. But I would probably say that there are better movies, but again, I completely agree with you that like this is just a fun comedy. I think if you're just looking at like a comedy from that standpoint, you're just looking for some like good laughs, especially kind of some just like lighthearted laughs. And I think if you don't take our criticism seriously, and our criticism for this wasn't serious in the standpoint of like the quality of the movie, I still think this is like a really entertaining, really enjoyable comedy. We're just here kind of breaking down like what this movie feels like kind of today. But the movie that I was going to say that I teased earlier, if you're looking for just sort of local, we'll call it local heroes defending the neighborhood, I would highly, highly recommend. It's a movie called Attack the Block. If that sounds familiar for people out there, it's where John Boyega kind of blew up. It's kind of what put him on the map. And it's basically just about this group of black English teens in London. There's I think an alien like egg or something like that like crashes in the neighborhood and kind of starts this like infestation, and so they as teenagers start to defend the block. And it's very just like, it's funny, it's kind of satirical, there's a lot of homage stuff, but it's definitely not silly. Like it's kind of like a cool like call it action comedy. So if you guys haven't seen that, highly recommend it. And I think even to the extent that he actually is, I think allegedly they're developing an Attack the Block 2, which I don't necessarily think they should do, because I think the first one was just like a great cult classic movie, but definitely check that out for as far as that. It's not a superhero movie, but just as far as, again, just kind of like people of the neighborhood defending the neighborhood itself. So keep that. That's it. With that, my fellow feathers and arms, that is episode number 5. As we mentioned up top, if you enjoyed what you heard, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a Patreon of one of our tiers that start as low as $1. Our Patreon is also where you can submit movies with similarly controversial issues for us to get into the future, and not all of those will be as heavy or as silly or as crazy. Yfran, I'm actually going to give you the choice here because there are so few movies. And again, I was kind of like looking through this list, and I was just like, we could do that, and I was like, but that's not. So both mentioned tonight. Actually, we might have mentioned one of these. In the Choose Your Own Adventure, would you like to A, go down the path, we'll stay in the 80s, 90s here, we'll revisit The Meteor Man, which is kind of similar. Robert Townsend gets his meteor powers. Or should we go the definitive route and revisit Blade, starring the none other than Wesley Snipes?
Wow. I really, really, really liked Blade.
Yeah.
I've seen it before. I haven't seen it again in a very long time, probably a decade. So
yeah,
I think that I'm gonna have to skip the genre of the Blankman. It sounds like the Meteor Man is more of like a same thing kind of thing, like comedy, superhero type of thing.
Yep.
Blade is where a good conversation could happen. I feel like not only that, I really want to watch Blade again. So I'm gonna go with Blade if we can.
Let's do it. So listeners, following along, we will be diving into Blade to round out our superhero genre here. And then if you are listening to this by the time we make our decision for where we will be going next, let us know if you would like to for us to go into horror or kind of straight comedy or maybe just sort of gangster film or whatever. Let us know. Otherwise, Yfran and I will make a executive decision on that coming soon. But yes, we will be watching Blade next week, which I agree. There'll probably be some great conversational stuff in there because there's actually I haven't seen it probably in several years as well. But I remember actually I definitely haven't seen it since pre Black Panther and definitely pre Mahershala Ali being cast as it. So that'll actually be fun to talk about. Other than that, listeners, feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for our aforementioned sister shows. Thank you, Yfran, for joining me this evening. Thank you, listeners, for listening. This podcast was produced by Pandora's Quack. He's Yfran Garcia. I'm Brandan Jones, and these are the conversations that quack. Good night.